So we would like to welcome you to the final in a series of webinars that we've been running over the past 2 weeks, following the launch of the Self-Assessment Scorecard and Guidance, which was jointly created by the Migon Club and Stop the Traffic to help local authorities and other public sector bodies assess their modern slavery risk. So this webinar will focus on the 7th of 8 themes that we present in the guide, which is reporting and remediation protocols. And we have 2 guest speakers from Helen Brammer Foundation to talk a bit more around that topic, which I'll introduce a little bit later. My name is Dami, and I'll be your host for today. But before we get started, it will also be great to see who else is already in the room. I see we have about 25 participants on the call. So please, in the chat function, if you can just write down your name, your role, and your organization, that'll be really great, so everyone else can see who else is here. And I'll give you a moment to do that. While you're writing that, just to note that we also have a QA kind of function as part of Zoom today. So if you have any questions as part of, about the guide, but also about the topic that we'll be speaking about today, and questions for our guest speaker, please do make use of that QA function and write down as many questions as possible. But I can already see some really great titles and introductions coming through, so please keep them rolling. It will be great to see who's joined us today. Perfect. So in terms of a brief overview, so I will share an overview to the scorecard and guide. I know a lot of you already on the call would have already joined some of the previous webinars, and you've already heard this already, so my apologies if it's a repeat of already what you've heard, but I'll keep it brief. I'll then introduce the reporting remediation section of the guide, which is section 7, or theme 7 of the guide, talk a little bit about what it talks about, and then I'll introduce the guest speakers from the Helen Brammer Foundation to talk on trauma-informed methods of working for local authorities, and also talk a bit about the modern slavery core outcome set that they have recently shared with everyone. And then we'll do a bit of a Q&A. So we'll have some time for questions at the end. So like I said, in the chat, please do write down as many questions as that comes to mind to give enough time to answer them. Okay, so briefly, for those who have not heard, the Modern Slavery Self-Assessment Scorecard and Guide is split into 2 elements. It is made up of an online questionnaire and survey, which allows you to assess your modern slavery risk. The scorecard has about 12 main questions, but there are a few sub-questions as well. And if you score between 0 and 175 points after taking the survey, you can think about your organization as being at developing stage in terms of your response to modern slavery. If you score 176 to 300 points, you can think about your organization as at an advancing stage, meaning that you've been on the journey for a while. And so you're not directly at the beginning, but you're working towards best practice. And if you score between 301 or 400 points, you can think about your organization as at a leading stage. And that means you're really incorporating quite a lot of best practice into different elements of your organization in terms of your response to modern slavery. So the scores are tiered, and the accompanying guidance correlates to the developing, advancing, and leading stages, and signposts to various different resources. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the guide actually includes in a moment. But on the right there, you can see a screenshot of the supporting guide. To get the most out of the resource, we highly recommend that both scorecard and guide are used together, and they can both be accessed from our website. So now onto the guidance. So as mentioned, the guidance should be read alongside the scorecard. It's a really long resource, and so we don't expect you to read it cover to cover, but it really is there for you to dip in as and when you need it, and depending on what area you're looking at, it's there to support you in that particular area. So the guide is made up of 3 sections. The first section provides the context of the project alongside the instructions of actually how to use the scorecard, how to use the guide, how to get the most out of this resource. The second is the main bulk of the guide and contains all the tiered guidance around all the the 8 main key themes that we've been speaking about over the past 2 weeks. And the final section is the annexes, where you'll find a list of questions in the scorecard, results of the supply chain risk mapping activity that STT did, a review of local councils' MS statements, and some more other useful bits and pieces of information. So like I said, there are 8 key themes that the guide and the scorecard touches on. This webinar will look closely at theme 7, or more closely at theme 7, reporting and remediation protocols. Just to give a brief overview about this section and what this section talks about, the first 3 pages are, look like the first screenshot on the screen there, and it essentially covers what are effective reporting protocols or pathways. What do they look like? The importance of them being anonymous, keeping records, keeping accurate records, managing reports, the needs to consistently review that process in order to improve it. It talks a little bit about subcontracted labor and how, subcontracted workers should be able to report modern slavery concerns, in their own language without fear of punishment, in confidence. And it really asks us the question of what mechanisms are there in your organization to allow that reporting, that smooth reporting for subcontracted workers to happen. It also talks a little bit about remediation protocols, what should be done by your organization once modern slavery has been uncovered, what processes unfold to ensure that survival well-being is at the center of those processes. How are you engaging with professionals or specialist service providers who can provide you with the expertise to adequately, support survivors of modern slavery? We also touched a little bit on root causes. Are you identifying underlying causes of that exploitation to ensure that it never happens again? That section is then followed by 3 tables, a developing table, an advancing and a leading table. Each of these tables are there to provide tiered guidance on developing and running these kind of reporting and remediation protocols, depending on which kind of stage you fall into. Kind of on the next slide, I'm going to just give a brief overview of what elements make up a leading kind of organization according to the framework that we designed. Under reporting, it's really having clear reporting pathways for both staff and subcontracted workers. And those reporting pathways allow subcontracted workers and workers to report in their own language. This reporting pathway is fed into all forms of training at the organization that happens for both operational staff and or supply chain, training if you do offer that within your organization. Robust processes are in place to resolve and report back on concerns. So where reports have been made, there is a process to report back and keep accurate records as and when those reports come through. You've implemented clauses in your tier 1 supplier contracts that require suppliers to have reporting and remediation processes in place as you you engage with those suppliers. And you've possibly started wider conversations about reporting and remediation and how that's handled in lower tiers. Not kind of a requirement, but you've possibly started to think about that process. In terms of remediation, survivor well-being is at the center of all those processes, and we're going to hear a bit more about what does that approach look like from the Helen Brumber Foundation. Strong relationships with local specialist charities in order to support survivors that you come across. You have good processes with law enforcement as well to ensure that any escalation processes are as smooth as possible. Investigating underlying causes of exploitation, as I mentioned previously. And if instances are discovered, maybe not so much in operations or in supply chains, if you take a cooperative approach and work with your suppliers to make sure that it doesn't happen again, rather than a straight kind of cut all ties approach. So hopefully that provides a brief overview of what this section talks about. I would really like to introduce now Rachel and Queenie. Rachel is the Director of Counter-Trafficking and Publications at the Helen Brumber Foundation, which delivers a tailored specialist and long-term counter-trafficking program for adult survivors. And then I would like to also introduce her colleague, Queenie, who is a fellow for the Modern Slavery Core Outcomes Set Community of Practice. Queenie has a strong background in large-scale program and event planning and management, as well as stakeholder coordination and engagement. So they're very, very skilled and have loads of expertise to talk about this area. Thank you so much, Rachel and Queenie, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dami. That was a lovely introduction, and it's really great to be here, actually, particularly as Queenie's going to be talking further on about the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set, which has a big role for authorities, police, and statutory services to play. So we're really excited about speaking with you today. I'm going to start off by explaining a little bit about training on trauma-informed methods of working and how that can apply to all public authorities and businesses and all agencies that come into contact in any shape or form with survivors of human trafficking, or as we call it, modern slavery. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see this, somebody, please. Go to slideshow. Okay. Is that okay, Dami? Can you see that? Yes? Okay, great. All right. So today I'm going to introduce by talking a little bit about trauma-informed methods of working, which apply for professionals of all fields and all disciplines who are working with survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery. And this isn't about trauma and clinical diagnosis and clinical work. This is about anybody being able to pick up methods that will help them to get effectively involved in situations where there are modern slavery, to make the appropriate referrals, and most importantly, to speak appropriately and safely with victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. So this is where we come from. The Helen Bamber Foundation provides this model of integrated care for survivors of human trafficking, modern slavery. We also work with people who are victims of state torture, war, gender and identity-based violence. So we've had a long track record of working with people who have been trafficked for all forms of exploitation, including all of the ones that you're aware of, but also child soldiering. And in the middle of this model of integrated care, we have our counter-trafficking program, and this provides support, safeguarding and prevention of trafficking risks for survivors who are in our care. And as you can see, it touches upon all the other services that we offer, and our team support and constant continuous discussion of cases is really, really important to us and to the clients we work with. We look after people for approximately, at the lowest, about 5 years, because it takes a very long time, both in the legal system for them to get legal status, and also in terms of their recovery, well-being and integration, which we focus on. And we provide support and safeguarding, but also legal letters and witness statements for courts in the immigration asylum process, but also the criminal justice process. And we obviously want to help the police wherever clients are able to do it, to report crime and to get traffickers behind bars where they belong. So as you can see from this list, common medical concerns for survivors of modern slavery include many, many complex vulnerabilities and medical conditions together. And when you come to the common mental health and behavioural concerns, there are many that we see behind closed doors, which, you know, as I will talk a little bit about going forward, don't just show themselves. It's up to us as professionals to know that they might be there, not to make assumptions, but to understand the effects of pain are very, very common in any person who's a survivor who you may speak to. It's very rare to be speaking to somebody who hasn't got a headache of some kind, and they might suffer pain in their torso. There's all sorts of ways of understanding the discomfort they can be in. And also, you know, in trafficking and in slavery, they have to survive by not demonstrating these to anybody. So they're very used to coping and managing. So it's by observing over time and creating relationships of trust that we can work effectively. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a common diagnosis among our clients at the foundation. So these are the things that these here are the symptoms that you can get from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But as you can see, they're the kind of things individually that you would suffer after such a distressing and horrible situation in slavery, where all of your identity is really crushed and you are having distorted, degrading relationships with people who are using you relentlessly and breaking all the common connections of human relationship with you. And so that's what we're dealing with when we see somebody in that situation. And as you know, if you go into a nail salon where they've got people who've been trafficked, or we go into our own waiting room, or you see people on the bus who've been trafficked, they're not going to be demonstrating all of these difficulties. The most common mental health problems in survivors of trafficking are anxiety, depression, and at the top of the list, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a complex form of it that you see particularly when trauma has been prolonged and repeated over a period of time, as it has in many trafficking cases. Psychological responses to human trafficking and slavery are important to understand because, as I said, the mental health problems and actually the physical health problems of many survivors are rarely immediately visible or obvious to others. People who've been trafficked and enslaved become used to minimizing, concealing, or just denying their injuries and suffering in order to survive, because it's literally a threat to them to communicate pain or need to other people who might spot their circumstances, as you know, and also nobody really cares. When we look at the situation where traffickers have taken victims of trafficking into hospitals and, GP surgeries and such, it's usually for the purpose of stitching them up, getting them ready to go back into exploitation. And there's all sorts of known facts about that, unfortunately, about accessing healthcare services just to get the job done and not to care for the individual person. After trafficking, people can feel stigmatized and or frightened about talking about their health at all. As we know, some of them come from cultures where mental health is stigmatized, but also just the reason why that they have these problems is so shameful in many cases. They feel inward shame. And if you get to know people well who've been trafficked, as many of you will have done, shame is very, very common, even when the rest of us would look at a case and say, how could you be ashamed? This is the shame of the trafficker. Often it's very inward, and that's because it is reinforced by traffickers on a daily basis who threaten people and tell them it's your fault, you're an idiot, you've done this to yourself, and lots of other horrible things that they say. The presence or absence of mental health conditions should not be assumed. So survivors should have access to a comprehensive mental health assessment if they wish, and to a program of specialist therapeutic care provided by an experienced mental health professional, which is something that we do at the Helen Bamber Foundation. Problems, and is also available on the NHS, or should be. Problems resulting from head injuries, but also learning difficulties, intellectual disability, and mental health problems can impair concentration, and this is very common in survivors. So the potential presence of these should always be considered and adjustments made where necessary. Who can I trust is a pressing question for most survivors after leaving the control of traffickers, particularly because deception, as we all know in this audience, plays a huge part in trafficking, and some people even pose as rescuers for victims of trafficking stuck in a situation and groom them into leaving a building or a situation with them, only to find that they've actually been sold to that person. That's how bad the deception can be. And you know all the other stories about grooming and telling people that they love them, that they'll look after them, that they'll give them an education, all of this. So afterwards, you can imagine people are very, very frightened of being tricked again, which is why it's so important to have trauma-informed methods of working to establish and maintain a situation of trust. So this is the world that we want survivors to walk into. As you can see, all these services here have a welcome face. You can see who they are. They have time to explain. They work well together. This is another reason that trauma-informed methods of working are good, because if you train your entire organization in methods of working that are trauma-informed, they tend to adapt them among themselves as well, because all of these agencies and organizations need ways of speaking to each other and working together. And if it sounds idealistic, I'm going to come on to a bit of a point where I think it's moved into practice already in one country. So we can sort of think about that, because unfortunately, and we see this every day, this is the reality of what people come into when they've been trafficked. And if you think about how frightened they are and how terrible the deception levels are, to come into anything like this, which is faceless or frightening or threatening, or basically with professionals who are too busy and too distracted to focus, you've got this problem. And this is another thing, as you can see here, when you have these agencies in this mode, but it's also very difficult for them to communicate proactively and well with each other. So this is a sort of governing rationale as to why public authorities and all agencies need to be aware. We are going to talk about the modern slavery core outcome set, and I'm going to be handing over shortly to Queenie Sitt, who is the Community of Practice Fellow for this exciting project. But just to say that one of the most exciting things for me, because I've been banging on about trauma-informed working for a very long time, is that in the top 7 of the core outcomes voted for, survivors put trauma-informed services. And one of the reasons I think they did, as I was part of the study listening to what they were saying, it was because it's what enables everything to happen. And without it, you have non-trauma informed services, and that doesn't get them anywhere. One of the things that we particularly picked up on was the relationship that survivors themselves made between trafficking prosecutions and convictions in relation to trauma-informed services. And as you can see, they do believe that this will help the police and criminal justice stakeholders and society as a whole to manage trafficking in a better way and to get survivors into the very difficult process of court witnessing and speaking out. So this is the modern slavery core outcome set, which we've depicted as a practice model. Queenie's going to take you through this, so I won't. But as you can see, trauma-informed services, as we've depicted it there, wrap around all of the other outcomes and are very, very important, and then lead off together with long-term consistent support. And these two things are absolutely vital to move survivors to a place of safety. So I wanted to just tell you a bit about what's going on more widely. So SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in America, has created a framework which looks a bit dry, to be honest, because it's lots of lists, as you can see here. But it has been adapted across many different professional organizations and worldwide. And it actually provides a really good structure or framework on which to design organizational growth in this direction for trauma-informed working. So I won't dwell on that, but just to let you know that that's there, and that we would always advise having a professional framework as a model for the way that you want to move forward. Now, in Scotland, which is the country I'm coming to, we were very pleased to see that they have taken trauma so seriously that they have invested, the government, in a national trauma training program, which is for their entire workforce, which is absolutely incredible and just shows how important they think this is. And it's not specifically for victims of trafficking, although there's a Glasgow centre, psychological centre, that has really grown in that direction. It's allowed a lot of understanding of slavery. And the fact is that if you do work in a trauma-informed environment, whatever trauma you're seeing, you're very much more likely to identify victims of trafficking, because there are so many common vulnerabilities across the spectrum of vulnerabilities that apply to survivors of trafficking. So because people who have trafficked tend to get trafficked because of a combination of vulnerabilities, this applies to British nationals, children and adults. It also applies to people who have been trafficked to the UK, and it also applies to asylum seekers and other very vulnerable individuals who are trafficked around the UK once they're inside the borders here because of their vulnerability. So this understanding of vulnerability, I think, is very, very interesting to attack as, a whole workforce, and to have that understanding. And I do think it's going to change the whole of Scottish society. It's a very interesting project. And so it just demonstrates that it can be done. It doesn't require that everybody should be a trauma expert. And I'm not a clinical expert. I work in a non-clinical way with survivors of trafficking, but I work next door to a clinical health service. So I have all the benefit of all that learning as well and working together. But it does not require that. The idea is that people are the most effective in their own role and remit in responding to trauma. So the Trauma-Informed Code of Conduct was written by myself and Dr. Katie Robdant. And basically it was designed as a very easy, simple way of helping people to do the following: to establish and maintain mutual relationship of trust with survivors in any working context or environment, to impart a consistent sense of calm, security, and safety in all their work. And we know that many professionals are very nervous when they do understand the vulnerabilities of what that relationship that they have and things they say might cause. And this is about reassuring them and helping them to work really, really safely and to know that they're doing the best thing. To increase the confidence of survivors and minimize the risks of causing distress and re-traumatization. And to help, this is a really important one for your workforces, to help professionals to remain safe and well in the course of their work, avoiding secondary traumatization and professional burnout. Because as we know, many people leave this field because they are burnt out and because they don't have the support that they need. And those people who burn out tend to be the ones who really have a lot of compassion and a lot of interest in the subject. And when they leave, we lose all that vital memory. So it's just really important to keep everybody supported and working in a trauma-informed way with each other as well as with survivors. So as you can see, I've put a little list of people that have had this sort of guidance and training. Police, particularly the Specialist Modern Slavery Trafficking Unit, or Vulnerable Persons Unit as it's called, the Victim Navigators, the Crown Prosecution Service, Trained Interpol, OSCE and ODIHR, health professionals, social workers, NGOs, lawyers, the Care and Quality Commission, Salvation Army, and the Modern Slavery Victim Care Contract providers. And also it informs the Modern Slavery Act statutory guidance, which we're holding on to and hoping survives the next legislation that's coming, because it's written rather well with a whole range of experts in the field. Now, the contents of the Trauma-Informed Code of Conduct are useful because they're directly about survivors of modern slavery, and they are directly about the exact way to work with them in certain situations that you're trying to do. So not everybody, this won't apply to everybody's work. There are many people who need trauma-informed training who won't be doing enabling disclosure and looking into the case and shouldn't. But that is there for people who are doing that. And then there are other things that are more simple for example, explaining professionals' identity, role and duties, taking sensitive information, working with interpreters and cultural medias correctly. And then there are some techniques about how to calm distress if it arises, how to set realistic goals and objectives, and also how to do remote online and video calls now that we're all in post-COVID and we're doing those, because you can do those in a trauma-informed way as well. So I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm just going to flip through the rest of it just to give stability. The tick, as we call it, because it's like a tick, Trauma-Informed Code of Conduct, carries little bits of advice that are very easy to digest about mental health issues. So it, for example, teaches you about dissociation without going into all of the clinical reasons for dissociation. It just explains basically that dissociation is caused by trauma, and it can result in a temporary detachment, which is sometimes thought of as being hostile or disinterested or not understanding, when really somebody has actually left their mind for a little bit and you need to bring them back. And the tick will show you how to do that, but also how to acknowledge that, because many professionals out there are not recognizing that. And it's often triggered when there's something very traumatic being discussed, or somebody just has too much and they go into that situation. It can happen for seconds, minutes, and in extreme circumstances, it can happen for a very long time. But the likelihood is that most professionals see it in a very short way, and it's important that they recognize it and know how to work with it. Trauma-informed environments are really important, and these, I won't go into them now, but use of natural objects and things like that are very helpful for the techniques when you bring people back from trauma and re-traumatization. And attending to minor choices and comfort of each person helps to immediately distinguish you from traffickers. The issue of light and space is very important, and I would suggest that light and space can be added to any room, no matter how small and horrible it is, how dark and cramped, because obviously being confined or feeling trapped in any way, particularly considering the kind of memories that people have, is really important to avoid. And all of this can also be created online And there are also advice about phoning and how you do that when somebody is literally hearing your voice and they haven't got any visual cues to manage. So this is all about online working, but I won't go into it, but it's just to show you that it's there basically with very simple advice. Working with interpreters, it's all about remembering. It's about the professional use of interpreters and how they should be used, but it's also about remembering that if you speak to anyone else near a survivor, whether you're on a raid in a site and you're a police or immigration official, or whether you're sitting in a nice office in a therapy room or another kind of legal room and you're just talking through an interpreter, or any other person, if you speak to them in a certain way that isn't trauma informed or is laughing or can be misunderstood, it can really make your work go wrong, as well as really isolating and making the survivor afraid. And as we know, they are very, very frightened of who interpreters and other professionals might be, including you. So lots of explanation is really required. This is a really important one, I think, and it's probably the one that I would suggest people have absolutely as a primary one. This is about creating the illusion of time, because we're all really busy and we often go from case to case or from difficult situation to difficult situation. And as we go through, we get more and more hectic, and all of that hecticity is being communicated to clients, whether we realize it or not. So professionals can increase trust and confidence by communicating in a way that creates this illusion of time. You don't have to share a problem or concern about time for a person you're working with. There's no need to share a frantic work schedule, halt a discussion abruptly, or walk quickly past them on the way to other parts of the building. Always stop and give them the same consistent response so that they can learn to rely upon that. Keep consistency and always maintain conversation at a normal, moderate pace. Even if you've got a minute, it's much better than talking about that minute, but just simply agreeing time for a further appointment. It's really important, particularly because of trafficking risks, that when they leave the room, they're very confident about what's happened. They know what's happened and they're not panicky or worried, and they're not communicating vulnerability to others, because as we know, some of us, there are perpetrators out there who really, really do go for people who've been trafficked and who are clearly vulnerable. So no hurried, swift eye movements, lack of contact, or any form of action which suggests that you're in a hurry, because actually that also suggests that you have a huge authority over a person, because we're never in a hurry for people who we don't have authority over, basically. And it's important to slow it down and give them a strong sense that you have the time to listen. So this is just an end now to reflection. These are things that you could take away. I do teach this course in a much more detailed way in different places, but a reflection could be whether you have trauma-informed training in place in your practice. Can you make any changes to your specific working methods or environment that result in better outcomes, and why? How can you influence other people who work with you to work in a more trauma-informed way? Do you think that trauma-informed training methods at your workplace will improve the culture overall? The ability to identify modern slavery, human trafficking, the ability to ensure safety for people who've been identified as possible victims of modern slavery. I would suggest that it would. And think of your own trauma-informed care, which is where this all starts. Where is your outlet culturally in the organization for speaking about vicarious trauma or professional burnout? Do you feel you can admit to feeling distressed about work sometimes? Is this encouraged in your workplace? What improvements could be made to ensure you have a pastoral, caring working environment? So I'm going to bring it to an end there, but if you are interested in trauma-informed training, do find out more about it. With regard to the Trauma-Informed Code of Conduct, you can find that very easily, free and online. It's on the Helen Bamber Foundation website, and I think you can find it in a few other ways online as well. Please check it out. You know, if you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me. I'll be really happy to help. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Queenie Sitt at this point.
Thanks, Rachel. Great. So I'm just going to talk through the modern slavery core outcome set. And I think before I go into the slideshow itself, I think it's important to just frame it in the context of remediation itself, in that whenever you come across a case of modern slavery or human trafficking, or where there may be cases, whether it's down your supply chain or further down, it's often quite important to look at what are the outcomes that we need to look at, that survivors need for their recovery, well-being, and integration. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll talk this through, and we can do questions at the end, I believe. Where is this? There we go. Right, I hope you guys can see that. Okay, so the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set, or the MS-COS, as I'll be referring to it for the rest of this presentation, is a joint project through a few organisations from University of East London, King's College London, University of Nottingham Rights Lab, a survivor organisation called Survivor Alliance, the Helen Bamber Foundation, and it's funded by the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre. I think I just saw someone raise their hand. Shall I keep going, Dami, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can do questions at the end. So
Okay.
if anyone has a question, they can just put it in the chat or in the QA.
Thank you. Yes, I promise I will make time for Q&A. So Rachel and I are currently running the community of practice for the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set. And what we'll do is we'll just kind of slowly unpack what that means. So with a community of practice, when my slides work, there we go. What we have here are actually the different types of organizations that we would like to work with and include in our community itself. And I've highlighted in yellow some that may be especially relevant for this group that we have here. So everything from the councils, local authorities and statutory services to anti-slavery hubs, government departments and devolved administrations, business and corporate organizations, those that hold a modern slavery victim care contract, and also especially projects such as the British National Projects as well. So what we really want to emphasize is that the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set project directly applies to those working in local authorities and government. And what we really want to do is we want to highlight multi-agency working in the anti-trafficking sector. And you can find more examples of this on our website as well, which we'll be sharing the link for. But here are just a few examples that you can look at. So there's the Modern Slavery Toolkit for the Homelessness Sector by The Passage. And it's really to equip homelessness organizations, local authorities, frontline workers, whether it's with templates, documentations, where they have identified cases of modern slavery and human trafficking within councils, within the Scottish Government itself, for example, is within their national strategy. And you also have networks across like West Midlands and also organizations such as Justice and Care who run victim navigators as well. So it's really about how do we all work together where these cases have been identified to ensure that we're really supporting survivors. So with that kind of really setting it in frame, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project and what the outcomes are and kind of go through each of those as well. So I'm not going to go through too deep dive into this, but it's really just a study overview of how we got to our 7 outcomes and a long list of 38 and the community of practice itself. So this was an academic project that kind of went through the different stages. We have a paper that will hopefully be published soon, but really what we did was we brought together survivors, practitioners, academics and policymakers. And from that, we generated the initial 1,313 outcomes and bringing that down to the 7 outcomes and the long list we have as well through surveys, workshops and interviews. And we also worked alongside our research advisory board, which is really important to call out because what we actually did was this research advisory board sat alongside of us for the entirety of the project. And as we move forward into it as well, these 8 members who are survivors themselves have advised us on different parts of the project. They're involved in our weekly updates. They often do joint presentations with us as well. When we do podcasts, they will also be involved in that. And it's really important to have their voice and guidance, whether it's via this project or any projects that other organizations may want to take forward in tackling modern slavery and human trafficking. So having talked about the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set and not actually showing you what the MS-COS is, a core outcome set actually has its groundings in healthcare settings, and it's really looking at what outcomes can be measured across all interventions as a standard. And it was really important to bring together a variety of organizations and voices as well. So whether it was the makeup of the project team, as you saw, from academic institutions to survivor organizations and practitioner organizations such as ours, but throughout the workshops, surveys, and interviews as well. So on the right-hand side here, you will see the 7 outcomes, which I will go through one by one. So I will just move forward from this one. And here you would have already seen this from what Rachel said, but what we really want is to have these 7 outcomes not operate just as a list where you read from top to bottom, but about how do you look at all 7 outcomes to make sure that they're all in place at the same time for survivors. And these outcomes should also be interpreted as widely as possible. And it's not just a short-term outcome or a medium-term outcome or a long-term outcome, but where survivors require these outcomes to be achieved, that they are achieved together, and these organizations can work hand in hand to support survivors as well. So as Rachel kind of said, trauma-informed services and long-term consistent support really wrap around the other outcomes, and it extends beyond just these 7 outcomes as well. So if I go through each of these now, right, so on the slide and for the next few slides, you will actually see the outcome itself in the green box in the banner above. You'll see a quote that's from a survivor leader. And also in the blue box, it's just a little taster of what's on our website that we really encourage that you can go and take a look at, and the different aspects of the website itself as well. So secure and suitable housing is probably the one that comes most front of mind and most relevant for local authorities. And it was actually the overwhelming top consensus outcome by survivors and practitioners during our project. They describe housing needs to be available and also secure and suitable for survivors. And when they don't have it, it's all that they can think about. And it's not possible to focus their mind on recovery or finding their life again. So really emphasizing the importance of not just housing, but secure and suitable housing. Just to kind of give you a flavor of the other outcomes as well. So it may not be necessarily something that your organization can individually provide, but it's about working with other organizations, considering what outcomes survivors need as well when it comes to remediation and for their recovery as well. So long-term consistent support is about needing that professional person who knows their personal background, who's able to keep them safe and supporting them. This is a very individual one for survivors about finding purpose in life and self-actualization. So as you can see, the outcomes really span across a wide range of possible outcomes. And they describe the self-actualization as light at the end of the tunnel for them. Another one that was really important for survivors was safety from any trafficker or other abuser. So as Rachel kind of alluded to as well, it's not just about the initial trafficking incident or experience that they've had, but actually making sure that they do not have the risk of being re-trafficked again. And therefore safety actually covers a wide range of things, from access to legal aid to the criminal justice system as well. And compassionate trauma-informed services, you've just had 20 minutes of this, so I'm not going to deep dive into it again. Access to medical treatment, so both for physical and mental health care. So one of the tools and frameworks that we would recommend that may be relevant would be the Safe Surgeries Toolkit by Doctors of the World. And it talks about how do we ensure that GP surgeries are actually trauma-informed, and how do they ensure that they are looking after survivors and they're working with them in an appropriate manner. Access to education was also one that came up. Survivors talked a lot about how they missed out on education, but also about what access to education enables them to have, such as confidence, fulfillment, and the pathways towards paid employment, but also the network that comes with that from friendships as well. So a lot does need to change with regard to academic and training institutions' awareness. And this care extends not only to survivors of trafficking, but also their children who may be in education or vocational training as well. So the phrase community of practice may be a bit foreign, so just kind of really explaining the 3 elements that we hope to have with this community of practice, and with all of you joining that as well if you're interested. So really 3 parts to it: ensuring that there is a shared domain of interest, there is a community where there's collective learning, and it's really about how do we put this back into practice. So therefore the community of practice in itself. So here are some featured models and frameworks that I'm not going to go through one by one, but really just kind of shows you the breadth of organizations, frameworks, tools that are out there in the sector already that can support everyone in the different outcomes. So we also have one specifically for working with the core outcomes as a set. So I will just hop on through these so that we've got enough time for Q&A. Here are some for housing, trauma-informed services, medical treatment, long-term consistent support, and also a section on the children models as well. So the MS clause is specifically for adult survivors, but what we wanted to do was to ensure that there is a connect between where it may be children who are being trafficked, and making sure that no one falls through the gaps, and we're working hand in hand with children organizations and frameworks and models as well. So now that we have these 7 outcomes, what we really want to do moving forward and really building out this community is to continue to harness expertise, whether it's with survivor voices, their participation, but also those within the community of practice itself, which is a whole range of organizations and individuals. We also want to make sure that we're keeping up to date with the best practices internationally. We want to continue funding for further research. That's something that we're currently seeking, as we want to develop measurable standards for each of these outcomes. And at the same time, we also want to learn from other projects on how the modern slavery core outcome set can be applied, both in practice, to academic research, but also conversely, what we can apply from other projects as well. So finally, some of the activities that are upcoming, please do have a look on our website, do share with your colleagues. It is www.mscos.co.uk. So it's mscos.co.uk. We'll be having focus expert online workshops as well. And we will be sending out invites to our community of practice. So do sign up to our weekly newsletter, and we will also be having podcasts. So a quick presentation through the Modern Slavery Core Outcome Set project in itself. And I can see that there were quite a few questions and chats, etc. So before we go into that, I just wanted to hop over to Rachel to see if there was anything she wanted to add to that.
Oh, thank you. No, I mean, the only thing that I would add is that if you go onto this site, we have discussion forums on each of the core outcomes. And you can go on and completely anonymously contribute to those. We made sure that was because we want a safe space for survivors, and also a safe space for people who want to speak out but don't want to speak for their whole organization, you know, so anybody can go on, and all contributions are really helpful. It's a moderated website, so it's a very safe space. The other thing I wanted to mention was there's 38 other outcomes in this core set, and they are interpreted as widely as possible. What we think is a good thing for the community of practice is the incentive. So in each of the updates, we highlight people's own work, giving them the full control over quotes that they have and things they want to share with the community, so that they can see the benefits to them without feeling that they have to show up for everything. And there's actually no requirement. If you sign up, you will get the updates, and there's no everybody's very busy, so you will be invited to specific events and forums and things like that, but there's absolutely no obligation. The idea is that we grow this nationally and hopefully internationally as well, and that we can start to make sure that everybody understands practice across disciplines as well as within their own, but in different geographical locations. So thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you so much. That was really, really, really informative. And I see we have a few questions, a few on kind of a trauma-informed ways of working, but also a few on the MS cause outcome set as well. So first question, which I think is probably for you, Rachel, can you unpack a bit more about how we can support survivors remotely in a trauma-informed way?
Yes, so I don't want to take up the whole question for him because this is something that's written about in the very easy to read trauma-informed code of conduct, which you can get off the Helen Bamber website. I have had feedback that when it's trained, people get a lot more from it, you know, because you can do scenarios, you can do group thinking. I teach it on the, well, I teach in various places, but the St. Mary's course has a multi-agency audience. So you have to think about all of the different professions that are around the table, which is great. So I would say that you can create a lot of light and space and certainty when you're doing remote calling. This is something we had to really think about during COVID time. There isn't room to train here, but it is something that you can work on. And I do suggest you have a look at that guide because it is so simple. One of the things that we really have picked up on is that sudden contact can be really risky. And it's good to have people prepared for what's coming. That's really important. And we particularly noticed that sometimes when you have this situation in the NRM, people will phone up outside of office hours and at all sorts of times to say, do you want to speak to the police or do you want to speak to someone? And they can get very alarmed by that. So there's a whole load of information there. And if you are interested in more training, then please let us know.
Thank you. Next question is, we have found that more departments in our local authority are coming across victims of modern slavery during inspections. Can you touch on how frontline officers, housing, fire, rescue, health and safety, licensing can build a relationship of trust with survivors that they may encounter during their inspections?
Yeah, so I would say about this that trauma-informed methods of working are absolutely key for all of those people. It's actually not safe, in my view, to have these relationships professionally unless you've had trauma-informed awareness and trauma-informed methods of working. I just think it's essential for everybody because it gives survivors the time and the space to collect themselves and understand what you're telling them and to respond appropriately. So it's much more effective. I think people who just want to get their job done and aren't so interested in the kind of ethos of it, although there are many people who are interested in ethics of working, just find it a lot more effective and reassuring for them as well. So I would really recommend trauma-informed training for those people, as the Scottish Government has done.
Great. Next question. So I think this is probably towards Peony. How do we measure the purpose in life outcome? How do we know if we are achieving this outcome with survivors?
Right. So it's really interesting that that was the one that was called out specifically because as we recognize as well, that is the one that is really difficult to measure in a very standard sense. One of the things that we really considered while we were doing these outcomes was that achieving purpose and finding that purpose in life and self-actualization is very individual. It is something that survivors themselves define and for them to discuss and agree on whether that is something that they have achieved. And it's not for any practitioners, frontline working organizations, or anyone really to go, right, you've achieved purpose in life and self-actualization now. And I think it's also really key to where people often think of finding purpose in life and self-actualization is the last thing that you achieve. And it's only when you've achieved all the other outcomes that you achieve that. But what the MS cause actually is trying to say is that it is something that survivors can achieve along their recovery. And as they go through trying to achieve all these other outcomes as well, it's not something that you can say to a survivor that is, you can only achieve this once you've achieved everything else. And it's about how do we ensure that we're really supporting them across all of these different outcomes.
And we have our forum, don't we, Queenie?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. So, and actually kind of going on to the second and third question of this, actually, is there advice on a website on how to reach each outcome for survivors? So 2 parts to that. Firstly, when we did the first part of our project, other than each of the outcomes, we also started drafting what each of those outcomes actually are. So what our initial thinking really around secure and suitable housing, what does that actually mean? What are some examples? So in the interim, as we start going into our second phase of the project, which is to actually talk about what are the standards for each of these outcomes and therefore how we measure them, we have relied on some of these models and frameworks that we think are really good practice in the sector itself, that we hope hope can lend towards how we support survivors in reaching these outcomes. And one of the most important things actually that we've heard from our research advisory board and survivor leaders is that oftentimes we need to think about how we're working with survivors instead of just for survivors in achieving these outcomes.
So there's going to be a second phase of the project, which looks at kind of what the standards for each of these outcomes actually look like as well.
Yeah.
Be aware of that. Next question. So for survivors who have no recourse to public funds, how do you recommend we navigate trying to achieve the outcomes for them?
So I can start and then Rachel can probably hop on. So I think it's really important to understand that, you know, not any single organization can provide support in all of these outcomes, but it's about how do we work both across departments, but also across the sector and also outside the sector as well, to ensure that we are providing that safety net for survivors and that it is not any single individual's job responsibility to be able to achieve all of that. So it's, you know, obviously there are some limitations where survivors, if they don't have recourse to public funds, that they are limited in terms of these services they may be able to access, which is a whole other conversation. But it's about how do we, you know, reach across and work with other organizations to do things like that. Yeah. Rachel, did you want to add anything to that?
Just to say that, yeah, one of the things that we always grapple with in this arena is, and we did it with this modern slavery trafficking survivor care standards in the UK, is like, well, how do we work with the fact that what is needed does not tally with what's provided? And the answer is that we all need awareness and knowledge of what survivors need. So basically, for people with no recourse, that is a fight and a battle, as we know. But what that practice model that was designed by myself and Queenie is to do is to take a really dry list and make it very recognizable so that people know if they're working with somebody who is a survivor and that piece of the puzzles are not there. And one of our survivors described it as a Jenga game. You take one away and it gets unstable. You take another one out and the whole thing collapses and that person is constantly looking for the other outcomes. If it's not there, you know that it's a good way of quickly telling that this story isn't right. And you use all the professional remit that you can in order to get that sorted out as much as you are able to. But obviously, for people with no recourse, that is a big argument. And we would hope that the people who are defending and working with those people join up and make that argument central to what we're doing. So we're very welcome.
Thank you for explaining. Very last question. Have you heard of any local authorities who've kind of embedded these outcomes in their operations successfully yet? Can you share any success stories?
That's for Queenie.
Yeah, so we are, as we start building out a community of practice, and we have started having conversations with quite a few different local authorities, both whether individually or also via some of the organizations we partner with. So for example, the Passage, they successfully connected us to both Southwark Council and also Westminster, where we have been sharing these outcomes. And I think, you know, in terms of embedding the outcomes, it's not very much it's not a program of work where you go, here are these 7 outcomes and the long list, put it into everything that you consider in every kind of intake form you have, etc. I think there is obviously an element around how do we ensure that as we work with survivors, whether through reporting remediation or some of the other some of the other thematic areas that come before this in the risk assessment, where we kind of embed that in a practical sense, there is also the sense of broadening what people consider in terms of how they're supporting survivors.
Yeah.
So it's not just, I will only help them access education and that's that, but it's how is their housing? Are they safe? And, you know, really just expanding that thinking around what are the other things that they do require for their well-being, recovery and integration as well. And obviously with the presentation we did with the Scottish Government, there was COSLA that was there as well. That's the organisation with local authorities. So right now it's really about having multiple conversations and iterations of the conversations and really, you know, bringing people together into the community instead of going, here is how you embed it and there you go. But really, you know, every organization is different, every local authority is different, and really supporting them as we go along on how and what is the best way to support survivors within the framework of the MS cause.
Great.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, actually, because Queenie's done some really brilliant work trying to engage different authorities and councils. And as she said, presenting to the Scottish Forum, there's also the West Midlands Modern Slavery Hub, which is a really interesting way that councils, authorities, police, all sorts of safeguarding, NGOs, third sector have got together and work in tandem. We featured this in one of our updates, one of our weekly updates, which is available on the site. So do take a look at that, because really that is the way an NRM should work. An NRM is not a small unilateral type of organism. It's actually, if you read the International NRM Handbook, it means that we're all involved. Councils are particularly a stakeholder in this, and local authorities. So do check that out. Thanks.
Thank you. I did read that most recent update. It was very, very, very extensive. So that's really, really good to know, and great to share with everyone else on this call, which we can do following this webinar series. So thank you so much, Queenie and Rachel, for a really in-depth presentation on trauma-informed ways of working and the MS-COS outcome set. So we've come to the end of our webinar series, actually. So the very final one, just to say for everyone on this call that we will share the recordings of all of the webinars all together. So you'll hopefully likely receive that this week, alongside any links to any of the partners that we worked with on this webinar series to their websites and PowerPoint presentations as well. So we'll send that over to you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to email me and I will signpost you to all the relevant people that have all the relevant information. But yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.